Welcome to our Cognitive Cocktails Happy Hour and GSBA Thought Leadership Session, Anxious No More. I'm Sucheta Kamath, CEO and founder of ExQ. We loved connecting with you during the GSBA Summer Conference last week, and we are excited to gather again, virtually of course, for another behind the scenes look at Full Prefrontal, our weekly podcast dedicated to exposing the mysteries of executive function. During the episode, distinguished professor of psychology at the Macquarie University Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow and the founding director of the Center for Emotional Health, Dr. Rapee, talks about anxiety in developing minds and the barriers created in childhood. When anxiety becomes persistent, it begins to affect many aspects of life and stops children from achieving their best. Ordinary support may not be sufficient, but rather well-proven techniques such as Cool Kids' suite of programs and ExQ for School can work wonders. Listen and learn more to help our kids gain infinite know-how. Welcome back to Full Prefrontal. We will dissect executive function into bite-sized chunks, and we will discuss how to become more proficient, how to gain knowledge about self, and how do we strategize to lead a successful life where we have all the information we need about self. And maybe we can even take some time to understand why we do things the way we do, what are the roadblocks. And so today's episode is going to be another fantastic episode because I have somebody very special all the way from Australia, Rapee. He is a distinguished professor of psychology from Macquarie University in Australia, and he is an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow and the founding director of the Center for Emotional Health. He has a background in clinical psychology, especially the understanding and development of mental disorders. His work specializes in developing treatment programs and evaluating their efficacy through clinical trials. Welcome, Dr. Rapee, to the program. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and thank you for having me.
So let's talk about anxiety. What is anxiety? How would you, is layman's understanding of worry when unmanaged becoming anxiety, is that fair and right way of describing anxiety?
Well, worry is one component of anxiety, definitely, and it would be what we would refer to as the cognitive component. So worry is about threshing over possible scenarios in your mind, looking for possible dangers, and then in a sense, one of the best descriptions I think of worry is a famous one many years ago of that it's failed problem solving. It's where people try to solve problems, but they fail. They don't manage to do it properly, and so they keep rehashing and thinking about them in different ways. And that's definitely a major component of worry. Of anxiety, sorry. But anxiety is more than that. And from a scientific, but particularly from a clinical perspective, the component of worry, of anxiety that we often think about is actually avoidance behavior. Most anxiety involves a tendency to try to escape, to try to get away from whatever it is that you're anxious about. And so the core hallmark, the core characteristic of anxiety is the desire to flee or to avoid altogether. And that's really a critical aspect, which I think any layperson would recognize and accept, but as lay people, we don't normally talk about it in that way.
So interesting. So bear with me as I formulate some thoughts here. So feeling anxious is normal and everybody experiences typically, I mean, anxiety is a uncomfortable or undesired emotion or a response to something that's invoking this sense of bad outcome. Is it what we are trying to avoid? Yeah. So what is it? Is it conscious process? Is it subconscious?
It can be both. So it probably involves both conscious, or I prefer to use aware and unaware processes.
Yes, I love that.
Conscious always has a whole lot of connotations around it, which is unfortunate. But aware and unaware. So no doubt when we're anxious, there are a lot of unaware urges and desires and motivations, but a lot of it is aware as well. We are aware of what it is we're anxious about, and we're aware of what it is we want to do about that. I think the hallmark definition of anxiety was the one, pretty much what you said a minute ago, which is that anxiety is a response to a perceived threat or a perceived danger. And so that's really what it is. It is just about, it's an emotion that comes up in a person when they believe, or not only a person, sorry, in pretty much any organism, when that organism believes that it is in some imminent danger or threat. And it's, as you said, because it's that sense of protecting one or emotion in response to a danger, it is normal. And that is extremely an important issue, that anxiety is very normal, and it's more than normal, it's necessary. You've got to feel anxious in order to survive.
Thank you for kind of explaining it that way, because I think one conventional wisdom commonly tells the term so loosely, and we use it intermeshed with stress and anxiety as if it's everyday affair. But what you're describing sounds to me, there's a way to distinguish a clinical threshold where it becomes a bare person's mental well-being. So would you be open to the idea of healthy anxiety and unhealthy anxiety, or do we say essential anxiety and unessential anxiety? Or is there a different way to understand when does it become a problematic issue in somebody's life?
I think what you've just said then is you've hit the nail right on the head, that it becomes a clinical problem, and I guess unhealthy or unnecessary anxiety are great terms. We tend not to use those, but those are great terms. It's a clinical problem when it affects a person's life. So that is the difference. So anxiety is normal. Everyone experiences anxiety, and those people who don't experience anxiety are probably in a bit of difficulty in their lives. Everyone has to experience some anxiety to survive, as I said before. But where that anxiety becomes so persistent and affects a person in so many ways that it actually starts affecting their life and stopping them from reaching their potential or stopping them from doing the things they want or need to do, then it becomes a clinical disorder. So, of course, when it's an extreme case, that's easy to decide. So when you've got a person who's so anxious that they don't leave the house, they stay inside all the time, they can't make relationships with other people, they can't hold a job, then it's clearly a problem. There's no question. However, when you have the grey areas where you have people who can do most of those things, but it's just those things are not up to their absolute maximum, it becomes a little harder to distinguish. But that is really the definition.
And so what's so interesting is, I think, because it's such a common place, people are not likely to seek help because they just think it's, oh, you're feeling anxious, calm down. And I bet that's like the worst advice you can give somebody is to calm down, because there's no understanding of what this message of worry or threat that person is feeling. And Sapolsky talks about this, that in modern world, the threat is not the tiger or lion that's about to attack you, but these psychological threats of being misunderstood or being thought as incompetent or being perceived as a failure can be incredible threats, right? So how do we understand? So can you dive a little bit deeper into this perception of threat? What is causing, what do people fear about when they are fearing, or that invokes fear response in them?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. I guess the list of possible threats is pretty much limitless in terms of specific topics. But when we do factor analyses or fancy statistical techniques to divide things up into groups, when we try to group different types of fears, interestingly, you do very, very broadly, at a very broad level, you find that fears tend to fall into two sort of broad groups. And one group are what you might refer to as physical fears. So that is the lion, the tiger, the fear of a burglar attacking you, the fear of being raped, the fear of being hurt, physically hurt in some way. And the other sort of fear is the more social. type of fear. And those social fears include the sorts of things you're talking about: fear of failing, fear of being rejected, fear of not being understood, fear of not succeeding. So there's more existential, but more sort of interpersonal types of fears.
Hmm.
And if we think of all the different types of things in the world that can make us scared, very, very broadly, at a very broad abstraction, those are the two sort of broad categories: things that can physically hurt us, or things that can emotionally or socially hurt us.
Your work and many researchers in this field talk about three core features of anxiety, avoidance, negative beliefs, and physical symptoms. Can you talk about the second part, the negative beliefs? Kind of almost like a thought distortion, you would say. Right, that's also at the heart of anxiety?
Very much so. So yeah, there's that. I guess we're talking a little bit before about the worry component. So there's that cognitive or mental component of worry, which is a very important part of it, which is all about those sort of negative types of thoughts about being unable to cope or being in some sort of danger. The distinction: most mental disorders have some mental components, but the distinction for anxiety is that those beliefs are still about danger. So that might be about, I am not going to succeed, or those people will laugh at me, or that walking there is going to kill me, or getting in that car I'm going to get hurt, or it's something about I am in some sort of danger.
Hmm.
And we know from a huge amount of research that people with anxiety disorders, that is, people with clinical levels of anxiety, tend to hold those beliefs in unrealistic ways. That is what we would often refer to as being biased or out of proportion to reality. So they will often, if you ask a person with a clinical anxiety disorder, for example, how likely is it that you will get hurt? How likely is it that something bad will happen? The estimate that they give you is usually much higher than someone who doesn't have clinical anxiety. In other words, they tend to overestimate the degree of danger.
Oh, wow. So, and that's measurable. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. David Burns, who has done a lot of work in cognitive behavior therapy, in particular team approach. And so talks about these 10 patterns of cognitive distortions. Is that a common understanding of these standard cognitive distortions that every person, or some or many of these components that people experience when they're experiencing anxiety disorder?
Yeah, I think certainly for many of the what we call internalizing disorders, or those disorders, particularly anxiety and depression, which are about ourselves, there is a strong cognitive distortion aspect to it. And there's a huge amount of research regularly demonstrating the fact that people with those very emotional types of disorders tend to be more extreme in their thinking. So in the case of anxiety, that people with anxiety tend to overestimate danger. In the case of depression, people tend to overestimate the negativity or how bad things are and tend to focus on the negative. So there are clearly many distortions. Dividing them into particular types and particular numbers of types is really more an individual perspective. And I think that sort of thing is done much more for the ability to communicate with the public. And so David Burns comes up with the 10 types. Tim Beck, I can't remember how many types he had, but he had a number of different types as well. I think Albert Ellis had a number. They all have different numbers of types. But that's really, those types are not necessarily scientifically demonstrated. It's more that they are a very, very useful way of helping people to understand the processes and helping to communicate that to patients and to help people get a handle on it. When we look at it in terms of research, you tend to, again, find broadly in anxiety at least, I'm talking just anxiety, not depression, you tend to find two broad types of distortions. And so one, as I mentioned, is that overestimate of the probability of danger. That is, you tend to think I'm much more likely to get hurt, or something bad is likely to happen, much more so than it really does. The second type of distortion is a distortion of consequence. So anxious people tend to also overestimate how bad that bad thing will be.
One thought comes to my mind about children as we are helping, and particularly adults, if they're not psych wise, if they don't have any psychological intuitions about how people think or behave, let alone deeper understanding of the clinical knowledge, a conventional wisdom just say has this tendency of using aggression towards them and say, snap out of it, or you're being completely irrational, or to yell at somebody for, why? Nobody's going to make fun of you. Look, I'm wearing big clothes. Nobody makes fun of me. So there's like these often commonsensical encouragements that people give are so ineffective. And because it goes at the heart of this anxiety and even depression, that people have this perceived notion of how one must overcome these problems. So what do you think, why is it so difficult for a clinically anxious or clinically depressed person to snap out of things or find meaning in advice that other people give?
I think that speaks to the nature of mental disorders, which is that they are not voluntary. They are very involuntary way.
Yes.
They are ways of thinking and ways of behaving, but they are involuntary and they are ingrained. They're often steeped in a strong background of personality style and the way the person deals with the world in general, combined with often a very, very long history of behaving in that way. So when you have someone who, for example, with anxiety, naturally has an anxious or withdrawn personality style, and on top of that has acted in a clinically anxious way for maybe 20, 30 or 40 years, to suddenly just say to them, well, just snap out of it. Of course they can't do that. It would be the same as someone who's got a really sunny disposition and is happy all the time to say, well, just stop it, stop being happy. It just doesn't make sense. You can't just change a personality like that. You can change, but it takes a lot of hard work and a lot of time. It's not something you snap out of. I think you hit on it before, a comment you made earlier also, was about that you really need to show some empathy towards the way people think, and the idea that anxiety is so normal and that everyone gets anxious to some degree. I think it makes it very hard for people then to empathize with extreme anxiety, because most people say, I get anxious and I can deal with it. And so it's very hard for them to really empathize with someone who can't handle it or can't get on top of it. But that's the critically important thing. Of course, everyone wants to be understood, and everyone doesn't want to be told to do something different or to snap out of it. People want to have some recognition that what I'm experiencing is very real and very difficult, and that I don't want to do it. I think that's the other thing. Often, as you said, for parents, but even for partners or others, there's this sense of, oh, you're just being weak or you're being silly. And they're not. They're not trying to do it. They can't help it. It's the way that someone has learned to think and to behave.
Let's talk about your wonderful book and all the research you have done. But those who haven't had a chance yet, but I highly encourage all of you to get this book, Helping Your Anxious Child. It's step-by-step guide for parents. And Dr. Rapee is a main author. He's co-written this with many others. Tell us about, you bring message of hope. So I'm so excited to know that there's something we can do. So talk about cool kids and particularly this approach to managing anxiety.
Right. Well, yes, look, I think our conversation has been fabulous so far, but it's been very much focused on adults, I guess, and the bigger picture. And so that just to say that anxiety disorders, clinical levels of anxiety can occur in children, and it affects around about 5% or so of people, of young people between about 7 and 17. It increases slightly in adolescence. And so many young people do have clinical levels of anxiety. And the treatments we offer are actually very similar to the treatments we offer to adults. It's really what you might refer to as a cognitive behavioral approach, which is that we teach children, young people, how to think differently about their fears and worries, how to approach their feared outcomes in a different way. And we teach them the critical issues. We teach them to gradually not avoid, to gradually face their fears, to get out and to do the things they're afraid of. Their parents have a critical role in this, and I think that's clearly the difference between working with children and working with older people, is that with the children we have the parents involved, and so the parents have a key role to play, where they really act in some ways as the sort of co-therapist, and the parent helps their child along the way with the process. The parent helps their child engage in activities. The parent provides rewards for the child. We also teach the parents different ways of interacting with their child, so they're not getting quite as caught up with their child's problem, but they're able to take a step back and in that way provide more help for the child, having a slightly more dispassionate approach. And so we find that it works incredibly well. We get, at the end of treatment, our usual treatment goes for about 3 months. And at the end of that time, we find about 60% of young people are free of their main presenting problem. And over the next sort of 3 to 6 months, we find that number goes up to about 75%. So once we've finished the Cool Kids program, we find about 3 out of 4 kids are completely free of their main anxiety disorder, which is a pretty good outcome.
That's phenomenal. So can you walk us through some of the, what would that might look like for a parent working with a child? And what's so interesting, I was in preparation for your this interview, I was reading some research about parents' anxiety, and there was one particular group that studied math anxiety of parents, and parents who themselves had math anxiety, and if they were helping their children had negative outcomes. But if the parents had math anxiety but did not help with the homework, the children were actually safe. So there's a way to influence, because that emotional contagion, you can feel extremely anxious if the person is anxious that you are with, right? So what you're talking about, this dispassionate, is that a sense of equanimity? Is that taking control of your own emotions? How does that look like?
Yeah, first of all, we know that anxiety runs in families. There's no question. There's a strong genetic component, and that relates back to that personality style I was talking about earlier. There is no doubt that there is something that is passed on, and so we do find that anxious children tend to have slightly more anxious parents. Doesn't mean the parents have a clinical disorder at all. They might be very, very high functioning, fabulous parent, not a problem, but they're more likely to be at that anxious end of the spectrum. And so what we do tend to find in a lot of our work is that the parents, when you have a child who is highly temperamentally anxious and a withdrawn, nervous type of child, often going way back to the day they're born, the parents and the child can often get into a sort of a cycle, a pattern where the child gets anxious a lot, cries a lot, gets distressed a lot. So of course, as a loving, caring parent, what do? You go and you help them. And then you very quickly learn that, oh, my child's going to get upset, so I better help them. And you start getting into this cycle where you're leaping in more and more quickly to the child's defense. And so what happens then? Well, a child is not learning to cope. A child is not learning to deal with life themselves, because every time they try and do something, the parent is there helping them. And so you have this cycle. It's not the parent's fault, but it's a habit or a pattern that they've gotten into as a couple, where the child gets upset, the parent leaps in and helps, and then the child doesn't learn that I can do it and gets more upset in future. And so part of what we do in the program is teaching parents to take that step back, to start to tell themselves, my child can do this, they're perfectly capable, and I don't need to help my child here. And giving the child a chance to make their own mistakes is the type of lesson we try to get them to learn.
And one very important component of that is that incredible tolerance for somebody's mistakes. Because another spectrum that I see, that the parents' desire to help or step in is to really not offer respite to the child or rid their anxiety, but their own expectation of perfection from their children, or unending expectations of excellence, which is just not possible. By definition, child is learning, So sounds like, do you see any difference in affluent versus non-affluent communities in terms of the level of anxiety? I had an opportunity to interview Sunia Luther. She's a researcher here, a social psychologist, and she found in affluent communities there were more stresses about this invisible kind of wall that they have to all climb, and parents were going above and beyond trying to get their children market ready, so to speak, and so there's like a generalized anxiety in the communities, not just a family. So the kind of school you belong to, everybody wants to Yale or fail kind of mindset. So do you see any difference that way?
Not really. One of the really interesting things about anxiety, clinical anxiety disorders, is that it is really non-discriminatory. It affects all races, it affects all levels of society, it affects all different types of people pretty much equivalently. Mental health problems in general are more common in the lower socioeconomic groups, and so people who are struggling with life's stresses are slightly more likely to have anxiety problems, but it's really much less of a difference than problems like depression, for example, which is much more strongly linked to socioeconomic level. Anxiety affects all levels of society pretty much the same. And that's one of the fascinating things about it. It's very hard for us to find causes or to find predictors because it's pretty much universal.
Thank you, Dr. Rapee, for being with us today.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thanks, Sucheta.
Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed our interview, and we are excited to invite you back to the GSBA Summer Conference portal again next week on Thursday for another virtual cognitive cocktail hour, where we will watch a new episode of Full Prefrontal and learn more about the value and importance of executive function for our schools, students, and ourselves. Want to keep conversation going and meet in person? We would love to connect this summer as you continue planning for the upcoming school year. Please reach out to Sucheta at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That is Sucheta, Sucheta, at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Also, sign up for the Full Prefrontal podcast on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, remember to join us again next week for a virtual cognitive cocktail hour right here with ExQ and GSBA on Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And remember to BYOB. Bring your own brain.